Well, as you probably heard, I am from Hawaii. So, aloha. Oh no, you got to do better than that. Come on. Aloha. All right. My title slide here, aloha and welcome, immediately gets us into the topic of language because it's redundant. Aloha is a welcome, but just in case you weren't sure, I did put a translation. On the other hand, when I translate aloha to welcome, it really narrows what it means because there's much more to aloha than the word. So I'm going to be talking today about language. One of the things about living in the only state that is officially bilingual, we have 2 official languages, is that language becomes something you become aware of very early on. In fact, if you don't learn what mauka and makai mean, you cannot get directions. One means towards the sea, and the other means towards the mountain, and that's the way all directions are given. In this presentation, I want to get you thinking about the language we use and how it reflects our technology and ourselves. Unlike Anne's keynote yesterday, many of you came and saw that one? Yeah? Some nods? Good. She talked a lot about the future. I'm going to take us back to the past, and I want us to remember where we've been and how we've changed. No, not quite as interactive. For those of you who are here, she got the audience up and moving. I'm going to take a little different approach. In fact, an approach that has become something I've really thought about since I moved to Hawaii. I'm going to do something called talk story. Talk story is a way of communicating and getting your attention through stories. It's an island way of making meaning between people. In particular, you probably noticed the title, I'm going to talk about names, what we call ourselves, and why it might matter. So, y'all have a name tag. I'll bet it has your first name and your last name. They seem to be pretty standardized. Probably has the institution you're with and the country you're from. But think about it. Would my name tag be different if it just said Ellen? Would it be different if it said Dr. Ellen? What if it identified me as a professor? What if it said I was an e-learning designer? Each of those would cause you to look at me and make assumptions about who I am. So names do indeed matter. They establish impressions of who a person might be even before perhaps we see them. A rose by any other name may not be the same, and thus, attention to our words and names has significant impact. So how did I get, onto this particular topic to talk about today? Well, let me just tell you that when they ask you to be a keynote speaker, they don't say, would you be a keynote speaker and come here and talk about this? They kind of leave it up to you. And so I talked to a couple people who were on the committee and said, well, what were you kind of expecting me to talk about? As you probably got from my introduction, I'm a generalist. I'm interested in everything. I don't have this great specialization where people go, oh, you're such an expert on that, we want to hear about it. And they said, we've kind of heard that you might be an interesting speaker, so do what you want. It's like, ooh, okay. So what got me inspired to talk about this today? Maybe it was my name. Maybe I have a fascination with names because I have such a meaningful one. I'm actually one of those millions of Americans who actually can trace our history back to the Mayflower. Wow, long line of ancestors, not necessarily all illustrious. In fact, maybe I was named after this illustrious ancestor. Interestingly enough, she has a connection with New Orleans. She sang with the opera in France. When she married the love of her life, who was the trumpet player, they dreamed of immigrating to the New World. So she got herself transferred to the French Opera House in New Orleans. Unfortunately, I wasn't named after her. When I was young, I was told I had a voice like her, but not her name. She's a Stephanie. So was my name like really meaningful? My mother told me she named me after her doll. Not my name, okay. Maybe I'm interested in names and language because, as you probably heard, I have an anthropology background. I did study linguistics as part of that. I learned some non-Western languages, which is a very interesting way to learn about your own language and how your views of the world impact the way you see it when you look at how somebody else sees it so differently. While this affected my thinking about this topic, it wasn't the real inspiration. So it's a lot more mundane. My colleagues know that this year we renamed our department. We went through a name change. We went through all the political issues at a university to change our names. We became the Department of Learning Design and Technology, or as we have come to shorten it, LTech. Now you might be wondering why you would be interested in the story of a little department out in the middle of the Pacific changing its name. By the way, I will note that I carefully picked this map because it showed the Pacific. I will fault the people who presented earlier and had a map that we simply weren't even on. Of course, this one's a little exaggerated because I can assure you Hawaii is not quite that big, but that's okay since it needed to make the point. So the reason I'm going to talk about this is, first of all, I think it's a good story that gets us thinking about bigger issues. And it also is a chance for us to reflect a little, not just on what happened in this one department, but who we are as a discipline and as a profession. And hopefully you'll learn something and enjoy yourselves in the process. In 2 years, our department will be 50 years old. We'll be celebrating and having a grand party, and anyone who wants to come to Hawaii for a good party, 2 years. All right, in that time, we have had 4 different names. So let me tell you a little about that process. We began in 1965 as a graduate program within educational psychology. And many of you know that departments like mine are often embedded in other departments. And educational psychology makes a lot of sense because we're interested in learning and cognition in addition to technology. 1 year later, in 1966, we became the Department of Educational Communications. Now, I'm going to try to take you back to that time. So this is a quiz. Who knows what this is? Anyone? A projector, a film projector, right? Mm-hmm. This one's not so difficult because actually film and projectors are still around. In fact, a few movie theaters have not quite gone digital yet, and they still use very big projectors that run this stuff. Okay, the next one's a little trickier. What's this one? Film strip projector, I heard it. How many of you did not know what this was? About half the audience. For those of us who are a little bit older, you may remember that before we had the kinds of multimedia devices we're all so used to today, you would get a strip of film and often a phonograph record. And you would put the phonograph record on, and it would give a little talk, and then it would go beep, and at the beep, you turned the handle to get to the next picture. Very, very interesting technology. My last one. Oh, everybody, you're all holding your nose, right? This is what we had to do before photocopiers. This is how we made copies. This is the mimeograph machine. It used some really nasty chemicals. I think back and I go, oh, we probably all poisoned ourselves with this stuff. And it left a very strong, it made purple letters on the paper and then had a very strong smell. And when you handed them out, the kids would all be kind of going, because kids have a better sense of smell. Ooh. Photocopies really were a lot nicer. All right, so back then, what kinds of courses were we teaching? In 1967, popular topics were utilization and selection of materials, equipment operation. Some of you may have actually, if you're old enough, had to take, and you were in education, you may have actually had to take one of those courses where they taught you how to thread the film and work the film strip projector and make mimeos. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Evaluation of materials, Production of non-photographic materials. You know, they actually taught people how to use flip charts. Yeah. Communication theory, history and philosophy of educational media, audio production, systems approaches, and photography. You learned how to work in the darkroom. The hot technology of the times, television. When I was in elementary school, we had one television for the whole school, and we were considered privileged. We forget that televisions were once an expensive technology. They were huge, they were big and bulky, and they were hard to move around. And so they were not common in schools, but they were considered a really interesting learning tool. In my department, back when it got started, they were instrumental in creating the first closed-circuit television station for the University of Hawaii. That station later became the state's educational television station, which most of you know is public broadcasting today, KHET, which signed on the air in 1966. Now, as we think about e-learning, one of the original major kinds of e-learning. How many of you are young enough to have watched Sesame Street as a child? Aha. How many of you are old enough like me that you first watched it with your own children? How many of you, in fact, are at that age where you not only saw it as a child, but you're now watching it with your own children? Oh, we got some of those too. Sesame Street premiered in 1969. We often tend to forget the power of this program, but today it reaches millions of viewers in 140 countries. That's pretty powerful e-learning. Not as interactive as some of the kinds we prefer to do today, but still makes a difference. Do any of you remember Channel 1 here in the United States? Any of you experienced that? Channel 1 was a commercial project that promised, because those televisions were still expensive, promised to bring televisions into your school as long as you made children watch their news broadcasts, which included commercials. Surprisingly enough, it was quite a successful model because schools couldn't afford the technology, and the televisions, once they were there, could be used for other things, but in the meantime, these commercials had a captive audience. But I'm getting off the story of telling you about our name changes, so let me go back to that. The field really started in particular as audiovisual, AV. At that time, in the National Education Association here in the United States, there was the Department of Audiovisual Instruction. They, in fact, started a professional association, which they decided in the early 1970s needed a new name. They wanted to get away from that AV thing because by now AV was sounding like a bunch of technical people who wheeled carts around the schools. They didn't want to be thought of as just those techies who, made the film projector work. So they decided they needed a new name. As with many things in professions, there was some argument about what to call the new organization. The Eastern US insisted that it had to have communications. California, always out there on the edge, insisted it needed to have technology. You can see the compromise, they just put in both. All right? In academia, names are often a challenge. We decided we wanted to be the Department of Educational Communications and Technology. We thought that hooking our star to technology was going to make us, in some ways, a more visible and important and impressive department. But interestingly enough, on the campus we ran into a problem. There was a dean who thought that technology equaled machinery. So let me digress once again and ask you, what do you think technology is? So let me give you some examples. If you do a search in Google Images to see what they think technology is, or at least their search engine does, you come up with these digital visions of the future. So technology is something out there. By contrast, if you do a search for machines, you end up with everyday objects like sewing machines, washing machines, and some old machines that I can't even tell you what they are. I, in fact, did another search in the Internet Archive book images. These are even older images. And when you ask them about technology, they're into gears and designs and patents. So in some sense, what you're beginning to see is technology is that thing that's magical and new. It doesn't fit necessarily with our everyday experience, but somehow seems like it will enhance and make it something different. So if we're going to become different, we probably need some different language to talk about it. But back to my story, the dean who thought that technology equaled machines. He gave in because he was reminded that one of the other deans came out of a department called Food Technology, and they did not study electric mixers. So we became the Department of Educational Communications and Technology. Of course, we had no sooner changed our name in the early 1970s than technology went through another one of those changes. How many of you worked on one of these? Oh yes, a handful of folks. The TRS-80, sometimes jokingly referred to as Trash 80, yeah. Any of you used Commodore PETs? Oh, some there. Now here's one that'll perhaps in different groups. How many of you used early Atari game systems, which came out a couple of years later? Oh, the gamers in the audience were already getting started, yes. All right? These came along and there was a lot of speculation about what these new technologies were going to do. But much like those televisions, they were expensive, they were hard to maintain, and for those of you who remember them, they weren't very user-friendly. Many of you may have used this one, Apple IIs. All those companies, in fact, made very, very major impacts on education because they wanted to practically give away their computers, only they weren't really giving them away. One of the things that's interesting is back then, one of the things that was taught was programming. How many of you learned to move a turtle around the screen? Yes. Now, I think it's interesting that we kind of have come full circle. We have things like Scratch today. And in fact, there are many calls saying that every child should learn to program. As someone who had to do this stuff back then, I'm not quite as convinced that every child needs to learn to program, but an interesting concept. So our department taught its first computer courses in 1980. We weren't like right out there on the leading edge. And by 1988, we had 2 tracks in our graduate program, one on design and development and the other on computer technology. There were obvious benefits to being in tune with these new technologies. So in 1988, let's change our name again. Now we became the Department of Educational Technology. And this was the name, actually, of the department when I arrived in Hawaii. It is interesting that we chose this name in 1988, but AECT, after which we had named ourselves previously, didn't get around to calling educational technology as sort of the central concept of the field until about 2007. Changing names can be quite difficult. Just as we changed our name, it changes again. This is a picture of the early internet. In 1987, the U.S. National Science Foundation made a decision to connect every university and college in the United States to this somewhat experimental network that up until this time had primarily had a couple of research universities and the military. In addition, they made a conscious effort to connect to global networks so that it would not just be something internal to the United States, but would really be a way to promote global education. It obviously did other things once everybody was connected, but really this educational piece was foundational to what was going on in the early internet. In fact, as Kurt mentioned, I worked on that project. I was a manager at Merit, and along with IBM and MCI, we put this network together. I can remember how hard it was to get a T1 line to Hawaii in those days, and you won't even believe what it cost to put that in place. We went out all over the country telling people that the internet was going to be the most amazing thing to happen to education that you have ever seen, much as people had earlier talked about television. And most of the people said, "What are you talking about?" As Ann mentioned yesterday, any correct prediction of the future is unbelievable and often hard to place in context of where you are now. So there was a lot of skepticism, but as you know, we were right, and the internet took off. By 1990, we have the World Wide Web, and then all the other amazing things that have developed there. Online communications, social networks, multimedia, streaming content, e-learning, gamification, virtual worlds, and interactive simulations. All things that make a difference potentially for education. And then things got even more interesting. Mobile devices. Now we can take our learning anywhere, anytime. Now, I want to acknowledge that there is still a digital divide, both in this country and elsewhere in the world. So as we have all these wonderful things, we still have to be thinking about how do we truly make it ubiquitous and not just for the few. But it's definitely many now, and hopefully someday it can be everyone. Through these new devices, we have increased potential for interactivity and multimedia, and increased engagement by the learners, particularly because now we have interactive instead of like Sesame Street where they're more passive viewers. While I've kind of emphasized the technology piece, there are some other things that were changing in this period as well. While we tend to be, many of us, techies who get excited about those new toys, I think that it's important to remember that at the same time, as we're looking at these changes in technology, there's been a re-emphasis from delivering instruction to focusing on the learner. And these new tools have given us the capability to reach more learners in different ways. We are able to get beyond reciting content to what Dave Merrill, a major instructional design expert, calls E3 learning: effective, efficient, and engaging environments. Social networks have allowed us to create much more social learning. And so we're no longer constrained by the physical environments of education. So as all those changes were happening, we look around. We admit we're not the guy on the leading edge, not us. But we also don't want to be the one who got left behind. So we want to be up there with the others. And last year, we began looking at our name because so many things have changed. We looked around and realized that the idea of learning was really important to be in our title. So we decided that we would become the Department of Learning, Design, and Technology. So now we're not only hanging our star on technology, but we're admitting that we want that technology to enhance learning. And at the same time, we recognize that good learning happens when design makes it possible for users to go through and experience. In looking at our title, first of all, we found a report from 2010 that said there were 34 departments that still had the name Educational Technology. But when we did our own research, we discovered only 3 of them were academic departments. The rest of them were the IT departments at their university. In fact, when we mentioned this to our secretary, she said, "Oh yeah, we get calls all the time asking if we're the help desk." Oh, we wish she had mentioned that sooner. We might have thought about this name change a little bit earlier. In addition, this article looked at job announcements. Educational technology or educational technology only appeared 9 times out of 327 job postings related to our field. And in fact, instructional designer, which we often think of as kind of a common title for practitioners, was only in 27 or 8%. We have a lot of different names. So, we changed. After long discussion, we became the Department of Learning, Design, and Technology this fall. That also took some political things with the university, but they seemed amenable. So you might think, this is the real name of our department. Change! They can't figure out who they are. I think we are the field of change. I think we are the unusual ones, particularly in academia, because we are willing to consider change. We welcome it, we consider it, we study it, we use it. So there we are. Over 50 years, 50 shades of meaning. Some of our colleagues think we are just confused. I mentioned earlier that we started off in educational psychology. They've been around longer than we have. Guess what? They've never changed their name. As far as they're concerned, the human brain hasn't changed in, tens of thousands of years, and there's really no reason for them to go in some new direction. When you think about it, most academic departments don't rename themselves. Who ever heard of renaming biology or chemistry, philosophy or sociology? Departments are more likely to die than change their name. Guess what? Food technology isn't around anymore. So some have suggested that we're definitely confused. We don't know who we are. We don't have any commonalities in terms of how we think. And interestingly enough, these debates about what we should call ourselves have become very public because the internet now allows them, instead of just happening within little academic communities, to be out there on the internet. So do we have an identity crisis? Do we have nothing in common? I'd like to think that you're all here because we have something in common and we know who we are. So think about it. Who are you? If you look at what happens in our field, it may sound like we're kind of confused, but I want to give you a linguistics perspective that suggests we are not. Language matters, and it creates our identities. And I believe that our identities are closely tied up with change, and the changes in our name, in fact, reflect our understanding that that is the way our world is going. But I will admit that sometimes confuses people. How many of you, unless you're a professor, my mother understands being a professor. She doesn't understand what I teach, but she does know what a professor does. How many of you, if you asked your mother, or if you told your mother the title of your job, would know what you did? I have to tell you, this was even funnier back when I was promoting the internet. It took my parents 7 years to figure out what I was doing out there. They had no clue about networks. All right? So just because others don't change their names, it makes us feel odd. But when we look at linguistics, it actually should make us feel better. Linguists are aware that language changes all the time, and that the changes in technology are reflected in our language and created in our language. So let me talk a few minutes about some linguistic things. Most of you are familiar with change because slang changes really quickly. How many of you are old enough to remember Groovy? Yeah. So 1980s. And what happened to twerking? But our technology, in fact, has created a whole set of new worlds. By the way, are you laughing out loud at this presentation? Interestingly enough, Selfie just got itself a TV show. And we hashtag our conference. So we can see language change happening because we experience it in short bursts through slang. But other things change as well. It may interest you to know that grammar changes. Some of you may be familiar with Lynn Truss's book, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves. This is actually the children's version, and if you've never seen this one, it's got the greatest cartoons in it. All right? So this is about the serial or Oxford comma. The serial comma is the one that goes in this thing, comma, that thing, comma, and the other period. So let me give you an example. The panda eats shoots and leaves, has no commas. We think of the gentle giant out in the forest eating the bamboo. But add some commas, and we have the big bad guy. Oh my gosh. Shoots and leaves, oh wow. I don't want to run into this panda out on Bourbon Street, let me tell you. But one of the things that's interesting about the comma issue is that whether you think we should be using the serial comma or not often depends on when and where you went to school. Younger people do not feel that those commas are necessary. Many of you, if you're in academia, feel they are necessary because MLA and APA require them. However, as Curtis noted, I am a journalist. Associated Press says, you don't need all those junky commas. They just clutter up the page and context is enough. So what we think about as proper language often has more to do with kind of when we learned it than what is necessarily proper. And from a linguistic point of view, there is no proper. As long as we are communicating effectively, it's good language. Of course, sometimes when you leave out the commas, it can get you into trouble. If you are job hunting, please check your resume carefully. There's a number on the internet of things that talk about cooking and grandma that I didn't want to go quite there, but cooking dogs, okay. So language does change, but sometimes we do have to be a little careful about our expressions. Another way language changes is an obvious one if you think about it. We take words we've used in one way and use them in a different way. In this case, once again, context tells us, and we are able to communicate about what kind of clouds we're talking about. So they come into common usage. The old survives, but the new is still in being used as well. Now, I want to tell you, I told you I was telling you a story, so I got to tell you a really interesting one. Technology has created problems in the way it's named for a very long time. How many of you knew that television comes from Greek and Latin? Really? It is a failure of etymological affinity. That means these two terms shouldn't be put together. And the classicists were appalled. They suggested that it showed that young people were not getting a proper education. Of course, it entered the language. Nobody thinks about where it came from, and not many kids study dead languages, so nobody cares anymore. And we went and saw television the other night and watched Monday Night Football in the bar, and never thinking about where the name came from. Television is no longer new and novel, and so it's just a part of everyday life, and we just kind of assume, yeah, you know, it's always kind of been that way. So language change, to some degree, is about pragmatism. It is about coming up with terms that we can find acceptable and allow us to communicate. And it's typically in the direction of useful, not necessarily proper. The language of technology isn't just about names, but it impacts the way we see ourselves as humans in the social world. Some of you may have read the book by Sherry Turkle that came out in the 80s called The Second Self. In it, she popularized the idea that thinking and language and technology were impacting the way we thought about how we presented ourselves in the social world. She even went further and said the way we see thinking machines gets us thinking about how we think. And we often use terms now that relate to thinking that actually are the way computers work and may or may not be the way the human brain does. When I think about worldview, I love the story of my grandmother. My grandmother was born at the end of the 19th century. She saw the first car come into her town. She lived long enough to see a man land on the moon. We think that technology changes us in many ways now, but imagine how different her life was and how magical technology was to a person who basically still did her wash in a tub, cooked on a stove that had wood, and if she wanted to get somewhere, either walked or took a horse. Our perceptions of technology are shaped by our experiences, and our experiences of technology shape our worldview. And all of these are impacted by language. We tend to think that new technologies change us dramatically. But you know, we're still human. They may extend our senses, they may allow us to do some things we haven't in the past, but in many ways we often keep doing the same things in new ways. I particularly like this quote. They were talking about language and technology, and they suggested that it isn't just about naming things, but that when we give things names, we help facilitate the way others can understand them. So we set the stage in our language for new ways to use technology, and that's true in learning as well. By using a term, for example, like e-learning, we imply a whole series of things about what's possible in terms of education. Those of us in academia don't use brand very much. It's kind of seen as that, commercial thing out there. But branding is something that corporations pay millions of dollars to come up with the right name, because it does create an expectation and an identity. And so names do matter. Language shapes our perceptions of reality. It shapes our notions of identity as well. And it makes the abstract, in some sense, real and part of everyday life. So I thought I might suggest that linguistics might help us think differently about what happens when we change our names and what we might be contributing back to facilitating the ideas of using technology in education. You've probably heard that infamous story about the Eskimos and their hundreds of names for snow. It's a very well-known story. Most linguists will tell you it's not true. But that's okay, the myth persists. The idea is that because Eskimos have so much snow and it's such a major part of their environments, they've become experts in snow. The reality is that, in fact, there were issues with translating between Eskimo and English. There were issues in terms of what you call a name. And there's some sense that perhaps the anthropologist who came up with the story just liked it because it was a good story. But the bigger issue of the story is it does suggest that people who are experts are more likely to have more refined names for things. And as experts, we have the ability to help people understand better, because we do have words and we use those words and we put them back into society where they can have an impact in helping people understand better how do you use technology in education. But we aren't just about technology. I mentioned earlier that we've moved towards the word learning. So another place where our words can make a difference, and I like to think that changing our department name moved us in this direction, is helping people understand the social aspects of learning, increasing effective practices through emerging technologies. So when we move from just the technical to the learning, we add back to the vision of how technology can have an impact. Another issue that I think we're aware of, and it's reflected again in our changing names, is that the field is continually changing. We've not only rethought learning, but I think we're beginning to rethink the teaching and designer roles as well. And most of us recognize that there are many, many pieces to it. And part of the reason we may have many different names for our different parts of the profession is that there are people who specialize in some parts of these, but in fact, to be really good, you have to understand all of them. So let me just ask you here, how many of you have a title of instructional designer? Very good. How many of you think you do instructional design even if that's not what you're called? Yeah, some of you do that. Now, how many of you are in academia, so you're called like professors or one of those? Yeah, a lot of you. That makes it easier. As I said, my mother has no problem understanding that I'm a professor. That seems to make sense. How many of you are managers or administrators and have a management title? All right, so all of you have identities in part through that. But then it may be if you're called a professor, you're like me, and you're in learning design and technology, and your mother still goes, what? It's always very hard when you're on a train or a plane and you're sitting next to someone. They always ask you, what do you do? And you have to try to explain. But then when you explain, they actually get kind of excited because what we do is indeed exciting. Designing exciting learning, using all that cool technology, yeah, that must be a good thing to do. Finally, something that perhaps hasn't been thought about as much, there are a number of calls by educational researchers for more precise language to talk about the things that happen in education. So we could use a word like assessment. It's kind of a big category. We could use a word like engaging. That's pretty vague too. But I think one of the things that we do because of our close look at language and technology and learning is that we are beginning to invent terms and disseminate them in ways that are perhaps more precise and can ultimately affect research by helping researchers understand better what they are researching. So, when we look at linguistics, we find that language does change, and that it changes both our views of the world and it changes how we can view ourselves. Whether such changes are seen as innovation or confusion may depend on your point of view and even when you were born. While academia may seem like a rather strict schoolmarm who doesn't appreciate change and is quite sure she knows what is proper, from our closer perspective on technological shifts, we seem to be the ones who actually are more able to deal with the way the real world is changing. From a linguistic point of view, there is nothing dysfunctional or dystopic about change in language. It's as normal as changing technology. Names do matter. Through words, we shape meaning, and we also can shape the way we see the world. So, returning to one of my original stories, you know those educational psychologists who never changed their names and are proud of that? We might reflect on that idea and instead say, they're the ones who are odd. We recognize that perceptions are colored by names, and those can be a positive thing. In our names, we establish who we are and establish our identity and can make a difference in the world. When we reconsider our names, we are in fact pushing language change, which happens anyway. And our new ways of understanding technology and learning are actually important to changing educational institutions. Peter Drucker, a famous management consultant, said, "The best way to predict the future is to create it." In making our name changes, we are in fact creating that future. There is no shame in being new. Mahalo. I'd like to thank you all for being here today, and I'd particularly like to thank all the folks from AACE and on the committee for making this possible, and I hope that you all have a good time while you're here in New Orleans and get to hear some more inspiring talks. Off to your next sessions.